This is the Fourth Hour with Stu and Pat.
888-727-BECK is the phone number. Welcome back to the Fourth Hour. Brian Sack, who is the guy hosting the BS of A on GBTV, good friend of the program, been on here many times, wrote the book BS of A, which is, I believe, a #1 New York Times bestseller for 40 weeks now. #1 for 40 weeks.
Pretty sure that's not the case.
On the, no, it's on the...
I think you're disseminating false information.
I don't think that's accurate.
Really?
42 weeks. You're right. I'm sorry. 42
right, 42 weeks now. Okay.
Yes, the other day, I think it was a debut program. Brian, who's not, Brian is, first of all, he's trying to be funny, which he is, very funny. And he is not a conservative. I guess I would consider him a libertarian. But he likes to bash both sides either way. And I think my inclination here is that Brian is making an effort to show that he will bash both sides and saying, look, I understand. I want to say, not only say there are no sacred cows, but actually put that into effect. So I appreciate I appreciate the concept of this joke. This comes from the debut episode on GBTV of the Glenn Beck program. Let's view it for ourselves.
President Reagan showed me that if you just ignore something for your first 7 years in office, like, say, the AIDS crisis, it's sure to go away and be cured on its own. No?
So there you go. Brian Sack talking about how Ronald Reagan ignored the AIDS crisis and did not mention the word AIDS until 1987. Now, the interesting part about that is, well, first of all, it's a very long-standing criticism of Ronald Reagan that he, of course, didn't like gay people or whatever. That's the people who charge it. The executive director for the National Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Foundation said he wouldn't be so angry about Reagan's silence and inaction on the issue if, quote, the Reagan administration was failing was due to ignorance or bureaucratic ineptitude. No, we knew that it was deliberate. Human Rights Campaign complained that homosexuals were considered expendable and forsaken by the President Reagan. Gay rights activist and playwright Larry Kramer went further. 2004 piece titled Adolf Reagan, which is a wonderful title. Kramer made the case that Reagan had killed more people than Hitler and said, quote, our murderer is dead. The man who murdered more gay people than anyone in the entire history of the world is dead. People magazine called me for a quote on Reagan's death. I wish he had died before he was elected, is what I told them. And he goes on to say Ronald Reagan did not even say the word AIDS until out loud and for the first 7 years of his reign until 1987. So that is the complaint on Ronald Reagan. Unfortunately, you may know by the tone of my voice and the fact that we're fact-checking a freaking joke that is not at all accurate. Let's start off with C. Everett Koop, for example. C. Everett Koop, he was, of course, he issued the first Surgeon General report on AIDS. That was in 1986, so it was before.
Been the Reagan administration.
It would have been the Reagan administration.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It said education about AIDS.
You may know him now from selling
some weird insurance product or smoking or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Education about AIDS should start at an early age so that children can grow up knowing the behaviors to avoid to protect themselves from exposure to the AIDS virus. All right, well, that's 1986.
That's one of his surrogates.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So maybe we should go to the guy himself. And honestly, it's 1986. It's just 1 year earlier, and it's just one of his surrogates.
Big deal.
So let's go instead
barely wrong
to Reagan himself.
All right.
In 1985, the same year that the FDA certified the first AIDS blood test, Reagan spoke about it at a press conference. Including what we have, quote, including what we have in the budget for 1986, it will amount to over $500 million that we've provided for research on AIDS, in addition to what I'm sure other medical groups are doing.
But he was talking about the diet pill.
No,
right? He was talking about the AIDS diet pill.
He's not talking about the AIDS diet pill.
Remember that poor thing when it came out? Golly, what a poorly named.
One of the worst named products of all time. We actually did something in Fusion a long time ago, which was the most unfortunately named products.
And that would have been one.
It was. I believe it was one. We should bust that. That was really funny. We should bust that out. Again, we'll do the quote, including what we have in the budget for 86. It will amount to over $500 million. That we
$500 million in 1985.
85.
Can you imagine that? That's a lot of money.
That we provided for research on AIDS, in addition to what I'm sure other medical groups are doing. And we have $100 million in the budget this year. It'll be $126 million next year. So this is a top priority with us.
Wow.
Yes, there's no question about the seriousness of this, and we need to find an answer. A few months later, in his State of the Union address, Reagan mentioned AIDS 5 times and later banned, of course, federal discrimination against federal employees with HIV. By the way, interesting thing about these press conferences is while the press today looks back in such horror that Reagan never mentioned AIDS, they didn't ask him one freaking question about it in the press conference. Reagan mentioned it at the press conference, and no one in the press mentioned anything about it, which I thought was mildly interesting. And then we go on from there because 1985, okay, sure, Ronald Reagan did it in 1985, but also let's go back even earlier.
Just 2 years sooner than they said he
just
didn't
2
do
years earlier.
Okay, so big deal.
Let's go back a little further. How about 1983? Reagan's allegedly...
Okay, just 4 years prior to when they said he finally did it.
1983, Reagan's allegedly homophobic health secretary, Margaret Heckler, declared that AIDS research was her top priority and told reporters that she would be asking Congress for $40 million to fund AIDS research, nearly double the requested amount. Which is weird that this homophobe in office would bother doing that. And then later on we find out the end of it, because we know that Ronald Reagan hated gay people. He despised gay people.
He did.
He hated them, and he did nothing for AIDS.
Everyone
sure,
knows
he mentioned it. His administration mentioned it at least as early as 83.
Measly $500 million.
And he mentioned it in 1985, and it mentioned it, or further after that, in fact, releasing a large report that was explicit about the AIDS crisis and encouraging education at a young age about it. Yeah. But let's finish it off with this paragraph.
All right.
Not only did Reagan and his staff speak openly about the problem, they also acted. During his time in office, he increased federal spending on HIV/AIDS from $8 million in 1982 to $2.3 billion in 1989.
Oh, my God.
From $8 million in 82 to $2.3 billion in 1989, which is a lot of money to be spending on a group of people you hate.
Remember, we found out about AIDS in 1981. So the next year they started spending $8 million on it.
And they turned it all the way up to $2.3 billion in 1989.
That's cranking up the heat pretty fast, pretty quickly, despite the fact it was not anywhere near. I mean, that's like cancer research for a problem that was nowhere near the numbers of cancer. Nowhere near the numbers.
That's true.
In America. Nowhere close.
It took a long time to really ramp up.
Some of the cancer people were a little pissed.
At the time, they were.
At the time. That AIDS was getting all of the money and all of the promotion when cancer was a much bigger health issue, killing more people and all of that. You know, not to diminish the problem of AIDS
course not.
In any way. I'm just saying there was a disparity there in the amount of cancer victims compared to AIDS victims. Money spent was totally out of whack.
Yeah, and I don't know, if Reagan was a homophobe, he was a terrible homophobe.
One.
Almost as bad
like Bush.
or I was going to say Glenn, who is the worst anti-Semite I've ever heard in my life.
True.
By the way, interesting thing about this research too, I thought, Pat, which was, if we could just get a shot of this. This is actually came from the original research. This is actually something that didn't actually wind up in the book because of space issues. But this is Glenn Beck's Arguing with Idiots, which is actually it was research done for this book, which is interesting because if you get a zoom in on this here. And I know I'm asking a lot of zooming action here today from Dom in the other room, but this is interesting. If you look down here, you got right down here, writers. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. There we go. Writers, there's me. That's me. And then look at that one.
Brian Sack.
Brian Sack was one of the writers of the particular book that was written for.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't write that, so I won't.
Okay.
And of course, and again, we are fact-checking a joke. But I do think that's interesting information because I will say this, and I am not a guy who falls for these things. I actually believed that was true. When I heard that in 1987, because to me, I was also a kid at the time. I was only 11 in 1987. But I don't remember it being a huge issue.
That is unbelievable.
And
you were 11 in 1987.
I was 11 in 1987. But I don't remember it being a huge issue, and I assumed that since it was a disease, as you pointed out, I don't remember the exact dates. You say it's 1981 that it was really became an issue of
Yes.
people became
That's
aware
when
of it.
Yeah.
It was one of those things that 6 years after, maybe he did misjudge it, and maybe he didn't realize it was as big an issue as he thought. Maybe he thought, people are blowing it out of proportion, or for whatever reason. I never thought it was homophobia, because I don't believe conservatives are homophobes. But I do think that I did think potentially maybe he didn't really. I mean, it's so prevalent that he didn't mention that until 1987. First of all, it's not true at all. And second of all, they spent a fortune on AIDS research. These guys dumped money into trying to solve this problem when it did take a while before people realized what a big problem it was. And yes, there were activists out there screaming about it in 1982, but, they scream about everything. I mean, sometimes they are. I mean, there's activists out there screaming about every little thing, and they don't always blow into such a big problem as AIDS did. But in reality, Reagan's administration, as early as at least 1983, actually did recognize that and upped the funding from, again, $8 million in 1982 to $2.3 billion by the end of his term.
It's amazing.
It's one of the biggest spending increases on percentage-wise on any disease in history.
Probably the biggest.
Probably the biggest percentage-wise, because it starts from a small number.
Yeah.
So,
and especially with federal funding like that.
Yeah.
As with Bush, who's a homophobic racist, right? And the same guy who gave more money to AIDS in Africa than all the rest of the countries and any other president in history combined.
Yeah.
The guy did $50 billion to AIDS in Africa. But he hated blacks, and he hated homosexuals.
And remember, we read the article, we did this story a while ago, that it's quoted the expenditure by the Bush administration as the largest expenditure by any world leader on any disease in world history.
It's unbelievable.
And yet he hates black people, he hates
blacks.
Africa, he hates gay people. It's
unbelievable.
Absolutely insane.
And, even a guy, a pretty liberal guy, like Bono from U2, and Sir Bob Geldof, both of those guys, super liberal guys, have both praised President Bush for his effort in Africa. He is credited with saving probably 10 million lives through his effort to help AIDS victims in Africa, increase awareness, get them the cocktail they need, all of those things, get them the treatment and the awareness and condoms, contraceptives, whatever else they did for Africa. George W. Bush did more for anybody, did more for all of those people than certainly by far than Bill Clinton, his immediate predecessor. It's amazing. So it was nice that at least Geldof and Bono, who are also crusaders in Africa, recognize that and have admitted it. So
yeah, and you have to. It's obvious. There's these, sort of long strains of accusation that go back decades of, it's always the same thing against conservatives, that they hate. That's why they act. They act because they hate. There's never another. It happens to this day. Every time that you disagree with the policy of President Obama, it's not because you actually disagree with it. It's because you're a racist.
Yeah.
And again, we disagreed with the same policies when crappy people like John Kerry were saying them, and you couldn't have those. You couldn't have the same accusations, and even though they still tried to make them. The point here is not that Brian Sack should be able to make fun of everyone, because he should. The fact is, here.
Maybe he wants to get his comedy correct.
Yes, you should know the damn chicken is crossing the road, Brian.
Yes, if the chicken isn't, don't say it is. Chickens don't cross roads as a rule.
No,
okay?
They don't.
And when they do, they get run over a lot. So let's drop the chicken crossing the road thing, could we?
Okay, maybe it was just an excuse for me to talk about the Reagan thing, but I thought it was cool anyway.
It is cool.